Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Houston's Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. It's Tuesday, June 10th, and it's a busy time for teams across the association, not just for the two teams playing in the NBA Finals, the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Indiana Pacers, but the other 28 teams. They're getting ready for the draft, which is a little over 2 weeks away. The start of free agency negotiations across the league, which is now under 3 weeks away on June 30th. Trades are being discussed. There's lots going on across the NBA, so it's a busy time for the Rockets, who are going through the pre-draft process, as well as examining their options for free agency and trades. We've talked about some of the external possibilities in recent pods with regards to trade pursuits, big names like Giannis and Kevin Durant. We've talked about some of the external free agency options, such as Brook Lopez with the Bucks. We'll talk about the draft in the coming days. I'm hoping to get more of an indication of whether the Rockets are actually going to stay at pick 10 before we do that. But if things look like that they're maybe staying the course, we'll do some draft talk in the coming days. This episode is going to be looking at the internal possibilities and what the numbers are likely to be if the Rockets, as reported, plan on keeping Fred VanVleet and Steven Adams, and also possibly keeping other players closer to the end of the bench who are becoming free agents or could become free agents. Guys such as Jeff Green, Jae'Sean Tate, Jock Landale, Aaron Holiday. We'll get to them, although we won't spend nearly as much time on them as we do Fred and Steven, because obviously they're not nearly as important. There's a reason they didn't play as many minutes. And I want to begin our conversation by looking at Fred VanVleet, because I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding, at least with the fans I follow on social media and message boards, with the leverage points in these negotiations and why I don't think they're as tilted in favor of the Rockets as some would like to believe. I saw Sam Vecenie of The Athletic, their NBA draft writer, who I really respect. He put out his Rockets offseason preview pod a few days ago and projected a Fred VanVleet extension to be 3 years, 90 to 100 million. That's if the Rockets don't pick up the team option on his previous contract, which is worth a little under $45 million for next year. It would be the final season of that deal. And then Sam projected Steven Adams to get 3 years, about $42 to $45 million. I think both of those numbers are perfectly reasonable. I'll explain why. There seems to be a segment of the fan base that thinks it's a little rich, especially for Fred. I think some of that could possibly be fans not recalibrating how they view and contextualize these numbers with the rising salaries across the NBA. You should look at it as a percentage of the salary cap rather than simply the raw numbers, which can give you sticker shock. But I also think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the leverage that Fred VanVleet has, and why, even coming off a year in which his surface level stats were a little underwhelming, at least in the regular season, there's a reason why he should be able to command that deal. And I do think it would be in the Rockets' best interest to do that. And so I'm going to spend most of this pod talking about Fred, because obviously the stakes are highest there, because we're talking about a lot more money. With Steven, I think 40 to 45 million is much more reasonable. With Fred, he could get as much as $100 million. And I get that there's some sticker shock when we're talking about a 9-figure deal. But I think we need to understand that both sides, not just Fred VanVleet, but the Rockets as well, are entering into these negotiations playing chicken. They both have something to lose. Let's be clear. Both Fred and the Rockets have said since the end of last season that they want the partnership to continue. And I think they're being truthful when they say that. So it's not a matter of needing to convince Fred of wanting to stay in Houston, or the Rockets needing to be convinced that he's the right path. No, both sides want to stay the course. It's just about finding a number that works for both sides. And perhaps I'll acknowledge there's a small chance that maybe there's a wink-wink arrangement and that number has already been agreed upon based on previous negotiations. But if that's the case, it is what it is. My inclination is actually that it's not agreed to, because if it was, my suspicion is that the deal would already be done. We know the Rockets pushed back the deadline for a decision on Fred's contract. It was supposed to be 5 days after the playoffs ended for the Rockets. Now it's June 29th. I think the reason they push back that deadline is because there is a little bit of negotiation that is going to happen and probably is happening right now. Well, I guess technically negotiations can't start until after the NBA Finals end. That's the exclusive window that teams can negotiate with their own free agents before the June 30th start of negotiations across the entire league. But come on, we know a lot of these conversations are already happening and have happened behind the scenes. Let's be realistic here. But to go back to the playing chicken component of this, with Fred, it's been said, and there's some truth in it, look, he doesn't want to actually enter unrestricted free agency. I think that's true. There's not a lot of teams with cap space. He's coming off a year in which, at least from a shooting perspective, he underachieved. He's 31 years old, and there are questions regarding the aging curve for smaller guards. I don't think he wants to leave Houston to begin with. There aren't that many teams with major space beneath the salary cap. And the few teams that have it, like the Brooklyn Nets, how much would they really spend on a 31-year-old Fred VanVleet? I think there's a point in which they would, where the value is so extreme that they'll use him in the short term, and worst case, they can trade him to a contender at the deadline and get positive value. So it's not that there would be no options for Fred, but I don't think it's ideal by any means. He wants to stay in Houston for basketball reasons, and also financially. I think he's comfortable here. He's talked about it being his home. There's not that many options on the market this summer if he was to hit it. So yeah, there's some truth in the argument of Fred being incentivized to get a deal done with the Rockets. And so theoretically, it limits his leverage. The problem is the Rockets are very incentivized to do a deal with Fred as well. And Fred's camp knows this, because once the Rockets gave contract extensions to Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green last fall, they committed to being an above the cap team for the foreseeable future. That's just the reality. You can't not spend money on Fred and then reallocate it to go and sign or trade for someone somewhere else in the NBA. It doesn't work that way. You can exceed the salary cap to retain Fred because he's your own player. You can't just immediately reallocate that money somewhere else because the Rockets are above the salary cap. So no, you can't just look at the 3 years, $100 million, whatever the deal is, and say, wow, if we didn't do that, what could the Rockets have brought in by reallocating that money somewhere else? No, that's not how it works from a team building perspective. So from a Houston perspective, it's somewhat use it or lose it. And Fred's camp knows that. Coming off a 52-30 year with the number 2 seed in the Western Conference, the Rockets do not want to take a step back. And Fred, for all of his slumps in the regular season, and I think some of them were injury related. We know he really struggled with the ankle injury in the second half of the season. When it really mattered in the playoffs, Fred was the Rockets' best player. He was outstanding. I think, for starters, when trying to determine the market value for these guys, teams are not just going to the front page of NBA.com and looking at regular season only efficiency statistics. No, they're doing a lot deeper dives into this stuff. And even when Fred was struggling in the regular season, the impact statistics on off-court data statistics suggest that he was still very valuable for this team. But underneath it all, I think what matters the most, the Rockets said consistently that they're going to need him when shit really gets real, as it tends to do in the playoffs when you play really good teams. And that's exactly the way it plays out. So no, I don't think that you can discard that series against the Warriors and say, oh, it's a small sample size, just 7 games. No, the Rockets are pretty insistent throughout the year that when it matters most and when defenses really dial it up, that's when Fred will be at his most valuable. When exactly what they argued plays out, and you needed Fred to be competitive in that series. If you didn't have Fred VanVleet, the struggles of Jalen Green would have probably led to you losing in 4 or 5 games. So Fred was very important. And when the way it played out was basically exactly what the Rockets themselves were saying throughout the year, it's hard to dismiss it as small sample size theater. No, there's something to it. The idea that Fred VanVleet is a playoff riser. Obviously, we saw it in his run to the NBA championship with the Toronto Raptors in 2019. That's a big part of what you're paying him for. He delivered when it mattered most. And that's part of the equation that gets left out if you're just pulling up the NBA.com profile page for Fred and looking at regular season only numbers and just very basic box score stuff. There's a lot more to it. And we saw that in the playoffs. And losing Fred for no compensation would be a blow, an unacceptable blow for the Rockets, because we can talk about some of these younger backcourt guys like Jalen Green, Reed Shepherd, and Amen Thompson gradually taking on more responsibility and eventually becoming, at least one of them capable of being the primary point guard, the engine, whatever you want to call it for this team. That's a multi-year process. That's not something that they're going to be ready to handle in 3 months when the Rockets report to training camp in late September for next season. You still need Fred VanVleet, and the Rockets saw that in the playoffs when certain younger guys struggled, but Fred stepped up, and that's how the Rockets were nearly able to beat the Warriors, even with a very down series from Jalen Green, at least offensively from a scoring perspective, a down series for Alfred Şengün as well. Fred has a lot of value, and the Rockets do not want to take a step back. You can worry about, I guess, what's the contract going to look like in a few years when he's 33, 34 years old? Look, the Rockets are worried about the here and now. And there are advantages. I mean, there's a reason why they're being talked about as a viable destination for guys like Giannis and KD. It's because of the on-court success they've had, which Fred VanVleet had an enormous role in. So I'm not saying that there are no questions about a 3-year, $90 to $100 million deal for Fred VanVleet, but I think they pale in comparison to a scenario where you just let him go for no compensation and you try to run it back next season without Fred. Because I think the Rockets would likely take a step back in that scenario, and the consequences of that, short-term and long-term, when you look at how desirable or not desirable they would be to players across the league, that would be a much greater concern, at least to me, than what-ifing exactly how Fred's going to age and what his trade value exactly is or isn't 2 or 3 years from now, which is obviously hypothetical to begin with. So the Rockets are not going to let Fred walk for no compensation. That's just a non-starter. They need him for the foreseeable future. So if push comes to shove and the Rockets and Fred just can't come to an agreement, I firmly believe the Rockets would just pick up the team option 1 year, a little under $45 million, and say, F it. Even if it costs us a bit more luxury tax money, we start the clock earlier, maybe you have to go even cheaper on filling out the end of your bench. Relative to losing Fred for nothing, the Rockets would pick up that option, as they should. Losing him for no compensation would be unacceptable. Both sides have something to lose here. Fred wouldn't be able this offseason to easily get, there are sign and trade possibilities, but that would require working with the Rockets. Fred wouldn't be able to easily get the money he wants elsewhere, but the Rockets wouldn't be able to replace his production as an above the salary cap team. They'd basically be losing him for nothing. So it's use it or lose it when we're talking about that money. So how you get to 3 years, $90 million, Fred's representation, basically they want him to be made whole. So the status quo is if he plays out his existing contract, the Rockets pick up that option, which is about $45 million for next year, and then he enters free agency at age 32. What could Fred get on the open market a year from now if he just plays out his existing deal? The Rockets pick up that option. So $45 million is in the bank, and then he signs a deal next offseason. I think even the biggest Fred VanVleet hater in the world would acknowledge that the worst case would be the non-taxpayer MLE. And I think that's far too bearish, but Fred is a winning player. Even if he goes out there and has another injury-plagued down year, he can get at 32 years old a 2-year MLE deal, the non-taxpayer version, which now has a starting salary of about $15 million. In that world, which is as bearish as I think you could come up with, and personally I think it's unrealistic, it would be 3 years, $75 million in total, because you'd be taking the $45 million for this coming season and then the 2-year MLE deal, which is about $30 million in total. And so over the next 3 years, he'd be getting about $75 million. The Bulls scenario, now I don't think he'll be getting the same money that he has on his current deal no matter what. I think being 32 versus 29, obviously that's a difference. And we also know the Rockets overpaid him a little bit, because when the Rockets signed him in June of 23, they were coming off 3 straight years as the last place team in the Western Conference. The Raptors were still at least a play-in team at the time. So the Rockets had to overpay a little bit on this current deal. It has him making $40+ billion each year to get him to leave at least a decent situation for a team at the time that was one of the worst in the league. And he was also 29 years old, so he had a bit more leverage. Now, with at least a little bit of a decline, which is natural as guys get into their 30s, and the Rockets not being as desperate and being 32 instead of 29, I don't think Fred can get 40s unless he has a crazy good year, and I don't think you'd be willing or should be willing to bet on that. I think if he has a pretty good year, to something closer to his year one statistics in Houston, where he was shooting, upper 30s from 3, I could see 2 years, 70 million, something that's in the low to mid 30s average annual value. You tack on that 65 or 70 million to the $45 million team option, and you're at somewhere in the $110 to $115 million range for the next 3 years. Well, you take the median of those two scenarios, the Bear scenario where he has a bad year, there's not much of a market, and he gets an MLE deal, that's 3 years, $75 million. And the Bull scenario, he goes out, plays well, and gets what I think is a reasonable deal at 32 years old for his level of production, maybe double the MLE, something in the low to mid 30s average annual value. That'd be 3 years, $110, $115 million in total. The median of that is going to be somewhere in the 90s. 3 years, 90 million to 3 years, 100 million. That's why Sam Vecenie threw out that number. I think it's very reasonable. I think a lot of fans view Fred negatively simply because of the contract, and that's fine. My rebuttal to that would be, for starters, with Fred, it's never just about him. It's about the collective. No doubt, James Harden individually would have been a better signing 2 years ago. The argument is that Fred, as a leader, what he gives you in the locker room, how he helps your defense, how he benefits younger guys such as Alperen and Şengün with how he runs the offense, not just for himself, but the collective, that Fred provides intangible benefits beyond just simply his own stats. That's the first thing I would argue. If you're looking at it strictly through the numbers, I don't think you're looking at it the same way the Rockets are in terms of valuing his contributions. But even if you don't buy that, even if you think Fred's overpaid, I mean, for starters, the Rockets knew they were doing that. They sort of had to, as one of the worst teams in the league 2 years ago. And now you're at a point where, with Houston being above the cap regardless, based on the raises given to Şengün and Jalen Green, you can't just reallocate that money in free agency if you let Fred go. It's use it or lose it. And I feel pretty confident in saying that even if he's overpaid, you'd rather have Fred VanVleet than just let him walk. The only argument you can make in favor of letting him walk would be the hypothetical of, well, I'm a little nervous about what happens in 3 years when Amen Thompson gets his max deal, and if Fred VanVleet making 30-something million at 33, 34 years old, is that going to be untradeable? Is that going to be an albatross? Is that going to cripple you with team building? That's very speculative. I personally think he'll age pretty well, very high IQ, good shooter. But worst case, I'm willing to take that risk when the alternative is taking a step back in the here and now, which I feel pretty confident the Rockets would do if they tried to run it back as is, but without Fred VanVleet. There's way too much to lose when you look at what would likely happen in the standings next year, the Rockets taking a step back, and the consequences of what that means for the development of the young players, what that means for the desirability of the franchise around the league, on the trade market, with free agents. I would not want to take that gamble. There's no perfect path. There rarely is. And so, yeah, there's some risk of, Is Fred going to be a positive trade asset on the third year of the deal? But I would rather risk that than just letting Fred go and having a worse team next season. Or I've seen some say, well, could you just pick up the option and let him go a year from now and hope that by 26, Reed Shepard or Jalen Green or Amin Thompson or some combination are able to fully take the reins? I guess, but the thing is, if you keep Fred at the same annual value that he was at last year, and you bring back Steven Adams, which we saw in the playoffs how valuable he is, and you're giving these big raises to Şengün and Jalen Green, you're talking about being well into the luxury tax this year, above the first apron in all likelihood. And so that has consequences, not just to, how many yachts Tillman Fertitta can buy. No, it has consequences to team building under the new collective bargaining agreement. It has consequences to what Rafael Stone can do now and especially into the future with putting together a roster. So the Rockets want to be careful with when that clock starts, because I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but the more consecutive years that teams are above these thresholds, the more strict some of these consequences can be. I don't think the Rockets want to start the clock this season to the extent that it would start if you are picking up Fred's option and going well above first apron territory. That would have its own consequences that I don't think are acceptable, or the Rockets don't want to accept them, at least. To me, the smarter play is to lower that average annual value, use the savings for Steven Adams, we'll get to him in a minute, and then take the risk of exactly how Fred's going to age and what's the value of that deal going to be if you need to trade in 3 years from now. We can worry about that 2-3 years from now. To me, that is the safest bet to make relative to the other scenarios of letting him walk altogether or just picking up the option and having a super bloated payroll to keep everything together based on how the Rockets finished last season. To me, looking at the three possibilities here, negotiating a longer term deal, moderately lower annual value relative to the last couple of years, that's the path that makes sense for the Rockets. That's why writers like Sam Vecenie have been throwing out something in the 3 for 90 to 3 for 100 range as being realistic. When you look at the team option, which is the floor scenario, projecting what his market would be a year from now, the bear market, the bull market, something in the 90s is the median. That's where, both sides risk a little bit, but they also get some certainty. And maybe the Rockets can negotiate Fred a little closer to 90, saying, hey, this gives you a bit more insurance in case you go out and, God forbid, tear an Achilles or something like that. But generally speaking, if it's closer to 100, I wouldn't feel terrible. Anything in the 90 to 100 range, to me, when you look at the market, when you look at the team option and the options the Rockets have and don't have if Fred wasn't around, I think that's a reasonable deal. And that's ultimately what I think happens. And I do expect Fred to be back. As stated, any win-now scenario, if you want to go down the road of pursuing a Kevin Durant, the Rockets feel like Fred VanVleet needs to be on the roster in any of those scenarios because they still need him that much to win at a high level in the short term. So if you want this team to play competitive basketball, if you believe that playing in high-stakes games is good for the development of young guys like Amin Thompson, like Alperen Şengün, which I firmly do, you probably need Fred VanVleet around. The Rockets want him around. He's a great leader. He's loved throughout the building. I expect him to be back, and that's why I think a 3-year, $90 million, up to 3-year, $100 million, that's the sweet spot for a deal, and ultimately I think it gets done around that price. Now, as far as other guys, Steven Adams, using that Sam Vecenie podcast as a template, he threw out 3 years, 42 to 45 million. I think that makes perfect sense. It's basically the non-taxpayer MLE. At 31 years old and coming off serious knee surgery less than 2 years ago, I don't think, even if the impact stats love him, which they do, I don't see a team with cap room like the Brooklyn Nets being willing to pay $25 to $30 million a year in average annual value. I also don't think it makes sense for Steven at this stage of his career to go to a non-competitive team. most teams around the league have access to the non-taxpayer MLE. Not all, but enough to where at least one or two, I think, would be willing to spend it on Steven. And he made $12.6 million last year. So getting a slight raise and access to the MLE, which is probably the full MLE, that's probably his market to begin with. It also happens to be in the same ballpark as what you're likely to save if you give Fred VanVleet the deal that I was talking about, take him down from $44.9 million next year to something in the low 30s. And so I think something for 2 or 3 years at non-taxpayer MLE money, about $15 million a year, makes all the sense in the world. And it's just going to come down to whether Steven wants to stay in Houston. I personally think he does. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of him leaving simply because, look, we can talk about the double big lineups, but he's not going to start here. Alperen Şengün is going to be the guy. He's an all-star for a reason. And so if some other team offers him a more clear pathway to minutes and the opportunity to start and not just be used situationally as a double big, but to actually be the primary guy at center, because we know in a perfect world, the double big is just another club in the bag. I don't think the Rockets will or should use it quite to the extent they did in the playoffs this year, as talked about in recent pods. I think that was more out of desperation. If some other team offers him a bigger role or he just wants to be another market for one reason or another, then say thank you. And I guess you pivot to backup plans, most notably Brook Lopez, according to the reporting that we've seen to date. But if that's the case, it wouldn't be about money, because the types of suitors that make sense for Steven, it's not like they'd have more money than that MLE. And I also don't think if you're the Rockets, you can expect him to take a pay cut, especially coming off that great playoff run. I think a slight increase in pay, something in the range of $14, $15 million a year, makes all the sense in the world. Hopefully Steven wants it. And if he doesn't, you wish him well and you go on down the list. Personally, I expect him to stay, and it works out well because in terms of the total payroll considerations, again, you'll be in the same ballpark of what you're saving with Fred VanVleet, assuming you extend him. And so the payroll will be going up a little bit between the Şengün and Jalen extensions, the big pay increases they get, but you can offset that a little bit by the combined value of Fred and Steven being a little less than it was this past season. So I think financially, there's not a lot to say with Steven. His market is pretty evident, and it's not like the Rockets are going to be outbid. They have bird rights. It's just a matter of where he wants to be. I think that's Houston, but time will tell. We'll see later this month. And then the other internal free agents, as we wrap up this mini pod, it's going to come down to roster composition. I think, the Rockets like having Jeff Green, Jock Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, Aaron Holiday, guys are that accomplished at like the, let's say, 9 through 13 spots on their bench. It provides a really good insurance policy to Ime Udoka, and if guys get hurt, which is inevitable over 82 games, it's really useful. But this is a team that's going to be more expensive, and that's if they just stay the course. They could get even more expensive if they make a deal for someone like Kevin Durant. So with the team getting more expensive, and the fact that going into the luxury tax beyond the first apron and so on and so forth carries actual team building penalties. It's not just whether Tillman Fertitta is willing to spend. And you have two younger guys in Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore. And maybe if you keep the number 10 pick, a third that you want to give more minutes to anyway. It doesn't make sense to keep those veterans at all costs, even if they're good on the practice court, even if they're good in the locker room. Because salaries are going up for the team as a whole, and because the CBA has team building penalties for teams that are too expensive, they're a good insurance policy, but they're not so essential that you would keep them no matter what, especially with the other young guys the Rockets want to give more minutes to as is. So I think the Rockets will explore bringing those guys back. Green and Tate will be unrestricted free agents. Landale and Aaron Holiday have team options at basically $8 million and $5 million, respectively. It could be a scenario where the Rockets ask all of these guys to take minimum deals. And if they're not willing to do so, or if they get better offers elsewhere, they wish them well. I hope that's not the case, but it very well could be, especially if the Rockets are fortunate enough to keep both Fred and Steven and or make a splash trade of significance, bring in, say, a Kevin Durant, someone like that. Then yeah, as the team gets more expensive, which it would be simply staying the course based on assuming you're able to keep Fred and Steven, and then the raises to Şengün and Jalen, and then external free agency or trade additions, at some point, something's going to have to give. And the Rockets are going to be much more willing to give at the spots deep on their bench, 10, 11, 12, guys that aren't going to be playing in the playoffs, assuming all goes well and you don't have any major injuries next season. In a perfect world, you'd keep all of those guys there, but those are acceptable losses. And so that's why I think, I won't say for sure that they would have to take minimums. Some of it's going to depend on, do the Rockets make a big trade or free agency signing? Are they fortunate enough to bring back both Fred and Steven? There's some scenarios where maybe they have a little more wiggle room and can go above the minimum, especially for Aaron Holiday, whose team option is like $4.9 million. Maybe that's doable. But I think they're going to have to draw some hard lines in the sand. And so if they're not willing to let Fred or Steven go, which for the reasons I outlined earlier in the spot, I don't think they are, then it's further down the bench. That's where the harsh decisions are going to have to be made so that the Rockets aren't deep into the luxury tax and starting the clock early, because we know this team's going to get more expensive in the coming years as guys like Jabari Smith and Tari Eason are due for contract extensions, and Ben Thompson and Cam Whitmore the year after that, and so on and so forth. As the young core develops, they're going to get more expensive. Harsh decisions are going to have to be made. That's the collective bargaining agreement. Jeff Green and Jae'Sean Tate were both making about $8 million or slightly under that in Tate's case last year. Holiday was at $5 million or maybe $4.5 million. Jack Landale was at $8 million. I hope they take pay cuts, but if they aren't, if other teams are willing to pay them more, it sucks, but you may just have to wish them well and try and replace them cost efficiently. That's the new reality of the NBA. As I see it, and I'll wind down the pod here, Fred and Steven are the priorities. I think it's fairly clear what the markets will be. With Fred, I think it's very likely a deal gets done. With Steven, I think it's reasonably likely, although I wouldn't say it quite with the confidence that I do Fred, simply because A, Steven will be an unrestricted free agent, and B, unlike Fred, there's not a clear starting role here in Houston. So there's at least a possibility that he might have wandering eyes and look for a situation that's a little bit better that allows him to fully unleash his skill set and play to the biggest role possible. With Fred, the Rockets obviously have the team option that can prevent him from becoming an unrestricted free agent, and he's running the show here. He's the floor general. He's sticking around. I think that's likely to happen. I think that's basically a lock to happen. I think Steven is likely to happen, but not a lot. And then the guys near the end of the bench, to be determined. I think the Rockets will welcome them back, but most will likely need to take pay cuts, and the extent of the pay cuts will likely depend on exactly what happens with Fred and Steven, as well as any other free agents and trades the Rockets theoretically bring in. Do they keep the number 10 pick? Because that has a little bit of a salary that accompanies that on the rookie scale deal, and so on and so forth. Stay tuned. Anyway, that'll do it for today, and until our next show, which I think will be more draft-based, unless there's some breaking news we need to react to, but assuming there's not, then we'll try and do some draft talk in the coming days. This was sort of my look at the internal options. A lot of our recent pods have been looking externally. This is internally what the numbers are likely to be for guys like Fred and Steven and other pending free agents from the Rockets, especially because once the NBA Finals conclude, which could be as soon as this weekend, the Rockets will be able to negotiate with those guys officially. Now, unofficially, I'm sure there's been some, at least, parameters tossed out, but officially, once the NBA Finals end, which could be as soon as, well, I guess, because it has to go 5 games, so I guess the soonest would be next Monday, but point is, it could be within the next week that the window officially opens and deals could actually be reached. Stay tuned. Anyway, until our next show, this is where we'll break, and if you want more content between now and then, the best place to get it is on social media. I am on Blue Sky at Ben Dubose. The show is on Twitter/X at The Logger Line. And you can also, if you have not already, please subscribe, leave a positive review at your podcast home of choice, Apple, Google, Spotify. Positive ratings, subscriptions. That's what we can keep looking good to sponsors and friends of the program, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, and keep this podcast running as one of the most active ones covering Houston Rockets basketball. Also, for daily coverage of the Rockets, please read USA Today's Rockets Wire, rocketswire.usatoday.com. I'm the editor, and so I've got multiple ones every day talking about the upcoming offseason, the draft process, what's the latest going on with your Rockets. Just hit up rocketswire.usatoday.com. Read my coverage. I would certainly appreciate that. All right, with those plugs complete, I will adjourn it here. As always, I appreciate you folks so much for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes.